Hello there, everybody. Welcome to the BSB Bookathon Fall Edition. We're excited to have you guys join us for these sessions. Hello, I am Melissa Brayden. I'm your moderator today. Our panel is Fact or Fantasy, where we will be examining the blending of the two as these authors take us through the world of speculative fiction. I'm going to invite our panelists to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about who they are and what they write. And I'm going to start with Missouri Vaun.
No pressure being first.
I know, it just threw you out there.
Thank you, Melissa. And it's great to see all you guys on the panel since we can't be together in person. My name is Missouri Vaun. I write sort of across genres. I do some romantic, just romance novels. And then I tend to write a fair amount of science fiction or sort of adventure stories just because I think they personally interest me. So I like to read those kind of stories. So it's fun to write those. And I have a book that just came out October 1st called The Sea Within.
All right. So we will be on the lookout for that. And I'm going to move next to Barbara Ann Wright and have her tell us a little bit about who she is.
I'm Barbara Ann Wright, as you may have heard. I write science fiction and fantasy as well as edit for BSB. I love sci-fi and fantasy for all the reasons that Missouri already said, so I'm just going to steal all her answers. I also had a book that's just come out. It is Lady of Stone, a prequel to the Periodiste Adventures.
Awesome. We'll be on the lookout for that as well. And Sheri Lewis Wohl, would you introduce yourself to us?
Hi, I'm Sheri Lewis Wohl, as she said, and I am all things paranormal. So it's witches and werewolves and vampires. And speaking of vampires, Avenging Avery is coming out next month. And Raand, as I mentioned to him yesterday, I really appreciate it being released on my birthday. So
we planned that.
I knew that you guys did that just for me. Appreciate it. So, but I have been a paranormal junkie since I was a little kid. And so it just delights me to no end to be able to write these and to have other people like them as well.
And what a fantastic title. Avenging Avery is what the book is called, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, I love that. And so we have our sci-fi representation, fantasy, and now paranormal on the panel. And then lastly, we'll move to L.L. Raand, who many of you know as Radcliffe, and have you introduce yourself to those who may not know.
Thanks, Melissa, and hi, everyone. I write paranormal romance as L.L. Raand, and my series is The Midnight Hunters. I have just recently, in September, released the 8th entry in that series called Enchanted Hunt. And the series basically is set in an alternate world where there are vampires and werewolves and enchanted sorcerers. There's a world of fairy. And basically, it's an adventure romance series. There are many romances threaded throughout the story. And in both the Enchanted Hunt and the one that precedes it, Rogue Hunt, which appear together in paperback out this past September, there are new romances in each of those.
Well, that's quite a variety. I like the enchanted sorceress idea. In particular, that jumps out at me. Well, I'd love to jump right in. I'm excited for this panel in particular because though I may not write in this genre, these are the books that I also grew up reading, even down to Choose Your Own Adventure with all sorts of fantastic characters. And so I'm thrilled to get to kind of ask some questions of you guys and hear your answers. So I'm going to start with, first of all, what attracted you to the speculative fiction genre, whether it be fantasy, paranormal, sci-fi, and what made you say, this is what I want to write in? And Sheri, I'm going to go to you first because you kind of hinted already that you've grown up reading these books your entire life. So can you talk a little bit more about that and how you knew?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it started even with movies. And when I was a little kid, the first one I remember seeing was the original House on Haunted Hill. Mm-hmm. And I was not supposed to be watching it, but I did anyway, and then kept everyone up all night because I was scared. And then, you move to Dark Shadows. And then I studied Gothic literature. So I actually have a master's degree in 19th century Gothic literature. So it's been part of me for a really long time. And it it fascinates me. And like I said, when I was young, I gotta admit that I honestly believed vampires were real. So I did sleep with a cross every single night, just to be sure. So
Well, that makes sense. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's been your entire life, even into your academia world, which is
Yeah.
you've been rather consistent, I would say.
I would say pretty consistent. Yeah. And vampires, you will see, even though I write a lot of the paranormal because I love it all, you will consistently see me coming back to the vampires because, you know, Dracula, loved him. And then my master's thesis was actually on Carmilla.
Yeah.
All
Nice.
right. So you'll be coming back. I'm sure the readers will not have a problem with that at all. Raand, I'll come to you because you didn't start off writing as L.L. Raand in the paranormal genre. You started as Radcliffe with romance first. Can you talk about making that leap and what made you want to write in this genre?
I think part of it, well, like Sheri, from the time I was a kid, I really liked science fiction, but I read more science fiction than I actually read paranormal. I read Ray Bradbury, Martian Chronicles, some of the stuff that was aimed more at kids like Tom Swift. So I've always been enamored of alternate worlds, primarily because it gave me a chance to imagine that I could be there. And especially as a girl growing up in a time when girls didn't get to do a lot of exciting things, this was a way that I could project myself into a world where I felt more normal. So I think that's part of it. But I had written, I think, 25 romances before I decided to write The Midnight Hunters. And it was a big leap because I'd never written anything paranormal before, but I love reading paranormal and I love science fiction and I love space operas. So I know the genre, but what I really wanted was freedom. I wanted to write a romance and a romance series outside the constraints of the world we live in. And I wanted to be able to, I particularly like writing werewolves, which are the predominant species in this series, although there are a lot of vampires and there are fae. I like the social structure of wolves. I think it's very interesting. I like the pack dynamics and I wanted to recreate that with my characters and not have to apologize for the power dynamic that exists, for the sexuality that exists. I wanted to write a lot of sex without rules, or at least rules that only made sense in the world that I created. So that's part of it.
That is fantastic to think about from someone who's never written in a world where I can just create all the rules. That does seem rather freeing, that it's whatever you want, you can decide that that's going to be a rule of this universe. Yeah. Interesting. Missouri, coming into writing, you've written romance as well, but what brought you to sci-fi and to your adventure background?
I think sort of similar to what Rad is talking about, like, you know, I remember reading Dune was one of my all-time favorite books, right? But a lot of the fiction you read, or when I was in high school that I was reading, the women didn't get to be the hero. You know, the women weren't the ones saving the day. And I wanted to write stories about those characters. So that makes it fun, I think.
Yeah, when you get to actually make happen what you've always wanted to see and make it come to fruition. That's pretty cool, right?
Yeah.
Barbara, dragons. So was it always a dream? Space?
Dragons.
I'm going to change my name to Barbara Dragons now. Yeah, I've always, I'm into fantasy and sci-fi and horror and paranormal and everything now, but it was, when I was a kid, it was a lot of fantasy. I read like Roald Dahl and E. Nesbit, people like that, because it was like I really wanted to like break out of my normal day and go off and have an adventure. And like Rad in Missouri, I didn't see girls in any adventure movies, fantasy movies, books, or anything from the 80s. It seemed like if you did have a girl, a lot of times she was part of a pack of dudes and she wasn't there to do much except get kidnapped. And I'm like, no, you know. So I had all of my dolls, and instead of going to the mall, we all went on adventures. And since most of the dolls are all women, especially Barbie dolls, I had one Ken doll. He had to get kidnapped because he was the odd one out. So it was a pack of women going off to save Ken from adventures, and I think it just ballooned from there.
I think we would love that story so much more. And that does seem to be a common thread. If you look at all of your answers, almost everybody mentioned wanting to see more kick-ass female characters and making that happen. And I think the world's a better place now for sure. Moving on, when writing speculative fiction, you're making the decision, to step outside of the world as we know it. What do you think are the most important ingredients to get the readers to believe the world that you're creating? In other words, what do you have to do to make the world feel authentic to the reader? Barbara, I'll stay with you for this one if you want to go first.
I think it all comes back to character, probably like in any genre. The characters have to believe everything around them. They interact with everything around them. If they are, I don't like this word, but like behaving like normal, behaving fine, or behaving like they would in any other book, then I think that is still what draws the reader in.
So character, yeah, I think that's an innate end for sure. Raand, what would you say? What do you have to? What makes them believe the world?
I think consistency is really important. I think that just like in any other book, the characters have to act appropriately for the rules that you set up for the world that you create, so that it makes sense, that they think and feel and act according to the social structure that you create, the politics of the world, the sexuality of the world, what everyone calls the mythology of the world. I mean, when you create an alternate world, especially if you're using paranormal creatures, you have to give the reader some sense that where they came from. Even if you don't go into great detail, there has to be an origin story that is really the foundation of that world, so that the creatures that inhabit this world have a goal, so that they're there for a reason, or they're driven by certain instincts or needs. I mean, that's how you motivate characters a lot in a paranormal romance, I think, or in a paranormal anything.
Yeah, definite food for thought on that one in terms of the consistency and not breaking your own rules and establishing that backdrop and a backstory. Missouri, what would you say? What would be your ingredients?
Well, a lot of my story ideas start with something that I read in a journal or something, or in the news. I feel like, there is a lot of science in science fiction, and some of my favorite science fiction is the stuff that's based enough in real science and real world that it seems plausible. So like you take a concept, whether it's time travel or faster than light travel or whatever, and then you do research about what's the current science on that topic, and then you just turn the volume up a little bit. So yes, you're creating like a new framework. Maybe you're expanding the parameters, right, that this science exists in, but you're using enough actual science for people to go, wow, what if that really did happen, right? Like you want the reader to have some sense of belief in what you're saying, and that they buy into like what could actually happen. So like in the book that I mentioned that just came out in October, The Sea Within, is about the oceans and about climate science and climate change. And, so there was a lot of actual science that went into laying the groundwork. And then I just sort of raised the bar on that story so there could be some heroes, right, that saved the day.
Which is perfect commentary on our topic here today, which is blending of reality with the fiction. So you're taking something that's based in reality and adding that interesting hook to it and adding the what if, which is great. And Sheri, I'll come to you last. What would be your take on those specific believable ingredients?
Well, for me, I tend to lean more toward urban fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
So that, and a lot of the characters and what I work with, I'm basing it on folklore. And so for the reader, there is a thread of familiarity already. And then it's just a case of blending it with the world that we know and twisting it just a little bit so that perhaps between the folklore and the fantasy and the reality, they can suspend the disbelief enough to make it all work for them and see that world as the characters see the world.
Yeah, through their eyes. Yeah, I love that. I'm going to go to, go ahead.
I was just going to say, adding to what Sheri was saying, that I love that I love when you tap into the folklore, because folklore just like, you know, science is based in fact, but folklore is based in some truth, right? For ancient peoples or whatever, like these oral traditions that get handed down. So there's already that sort of that emotional connection to the story that you're telling. So I love using folklore in stories. Sorry, just want to jump in and say
No,
that.
no, I think that adds great texture to it for sure. I'm going to go to an attendee question now from Cynthia. The question is, it seems like fantasy and sci-fi have a lot of characters and power dynamics between groups. How do you keep it straight, and how do you keep from confusing the reader between all the characters and all the different power dynamics? Missouri, do you want to go first on this one?
You have a really good editor that puts notes in the margins and tells you, like, nobody understands what you're saying here. And I remember one time I was trying to create this really complex power dynamic thing, and my editor, who is Cindy Cressup, who's really, really a great editor to work with, she said, she made some comment. She was making a reference to Star Wars and saying, we don't need to know every reason that Luke hates the Empire. It's enough to know that he does, or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, I had just gone down this rabbit hole of, like, you know, needing to layer all this stuff on, and I was confusing the reader. So I think, so my point is, having a really good editor, having really good beta readers sometimes kind of pull you back from the edge, because it's really easy to get lost in your own research sometimes, and, you know, want to include things that maybe aren't necessary to move the story forward.
Yeah, I think editor Cindy has some good words of wisdom there.
Yeah.
Brad, what's your advice on keeping them straight?
I think that it's important to have a reasonably small number of core characters who are very well developed, especially if you're writing a series, and so that you may not include all of them in every book, but you have enough to continue the familiar thread. Yes, there will be a lot of characters, but they all don't have to be developed to the same degree. But every character, if you're going to really use them, they ought to be there for a purpose, and they ought to be identifiable in some way. Give them some particular trait that the reader can form an image and hang on to, either a speech pattern, a facial tic, an attitude, so that even if they're peripheral, they're distinctive. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think that's great advice across any genre, really.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, I'm just thinking of The Expanse. If you're a, you know, sci-fi reader or viewer, there's like 5 people in a spaceship. And, you know, that's the core. And there's lots of other peripheral people, and you know them all because they have some distinctive factor that identifies them.
Quite true, quite true. Sheri, what's your tip for keeping them all straight and not confusing the power?
You know, I'm following with Rad right there too. And for me, the character really has to have a function in the story that moves it forward. And so it saves from getting it too populated and too confusing. I mean, sometimes you do get kind of carried away and you confuse yourself. And if you're confusing yourself, you're sure as heck going to confuse the reader. And then I have to ask myself, what is this character's function and how is this character moving the story forward? So if they're not, I invite them to leave.
Just cut from the story. You're out of there. And so Barbara, I know from just chatting with you before that sometimes you'll have side characters that you'll just drop off in a coffee shop and then remember you have to go back for them later because they've been there for the whole book. So, and that's something you can fix in post. But how do you, by the end of it all, help them sort it out?
I keep notes, copious notes. You can probably see some of the notebooks here behind me. I have a few more sitting here on my desk. I make notes about everything. I make notes about what characters look like, what traits they have, what are they doing in the story, who do they hate, who do they love. I wrote a sci-fi series, the Godfall series, which had a lot of characters doing a lot of stuff. And so I had to write them down. And you're right, sometimes it was like, oh, he came in the first chapter, he said an important thing to the plot, and then he left, and we never see him again. He fell down a hole and drowned. And I was like, well, crap, got to go edit that back out, make it somebody else who's important to the story, and move on. And luckily I've had people reading for me and an editor who's caught those sort of things. But a lot of notes help you, as well as letting you see how long it's been since this person has appeared, so that they can say, something like, she remembered when she did that thing that one time, so the reader can be like, oh, it's her, I remember that, yeah. And without that sounding like, dear reader, remember when I did this thing?
By the way.
By the way, yeah. Including those little sorts of things is very helpful to me, and I think to readers too.
Yeah, a little signposts along the way that direct them. Makes sense. I have another attendee question from Joni. Do you come up with the world first? Do you find yourself spending time creating the world before you create the characters and the plot? So I guess the question is essentially, which element of the story comes first, the world or the people or the conflict? Sheri, I'll ask you first.
That I had to stop and think about that, but I think for me, in a lot of ways, I come up with the world first. And then it's, how do these characters fit into this world? So like Avenging Avery, there's actually a secret society. And that, for whatever reason, captured my attention. So I started with that, built around that, and came up with a story about a whole lot of revenge, and love too, because I gotta have love. But yeah, for me it was at least with this last one, it was the world first and then the characters.
All right. And Missouri, what would your answer be?
Sometimes it's different things with different stories. Most times it's character first, actually. Like I hear a conversation start in my head, or I see a scene in my head that's sort of like remembering a movie, a scene in a movie. And then the world just kind of ripples out from that. But sometimes it is the situation that is interests you, that you want to write about, that you sort of build a story based on that interest. And then the characters come later. So a little of both, I guess.
This one, characters, it sounds like, yeah.
Yeah.
Barbara, what would your answer be?
I think I've done at least one of those at some point. I've done the character. I've been like, what are you, if you have a magical lesbian that keeps exploding? Or I've been like, what if you have a world where magic is outlawed, but there's good people on both sides and they're all lesbians? Or I forget what the last one was, but it was world building, character, or plot. Or I guess those are all kinds of the same thing. But I've started with all of them. I mean, as long as you're starting, I think, with the sarcastic lesbian and then going from there, you can't go wrong.
You heard it here. Always start with the sarcastic lesbian. You'll be fine, everybody. Write that down. Raand, for you, what comes first?
Well, I start with the sexy lesbian.
Lesbian.
And then I go from there. But for the paranormal world, I think almost simultaneously, I knew I wanted to write more than one species. So I knew that I was going to do shapeshifters and vampires and sorcerers. And then I thought about the origin story, because I think it's really, as Sheri was saying earlier, readers are familiar with the genre, so they have expectations for what vampires do or what werewolves do. And my werewolves in particular are completely unlike most werewolves that you might commonly see, in that they're not sick, they're not diseased, and there's nothing wrong with them. That was one of the most important things that I wanted to write in this world. It's an analogy. The story is obviously something of an analogy to what's happening, in that they were a society that lived hidden for centuries because they were hunted. And when eventually it became essential for them, in order to survive, to be visible, they came out in what was called the Exodus. And the story is about what happens to the others in a world where they are a smaller population than the predominant humans. And so for me, it was really important to, as Missouri was saying, I had to come up with medical, scientific kind of creation story for these paranormal beings who are not human and were never human. So that was the fun part for me, and to thread that into the story so that it made sense. So character first and then the world.
All right. So it sounds like we got a variety of different answers, which just shows you that every writer is different and their process is a little bit different. And I want to thank our attendees for those last 2 questions, which were fantastic. Keep those questions coming in the Q&A box. But for now, I'm going to grab one of mine. And I'd like to ask you guys to talk a little bit about the culture or the rules of the world, either one, in your current release or series, and just talk to us about how those rules or culture differ from our own. Barbara, I'll start with you.
So the Lady of Stone is set in the same universe as the Pyramid Waltz, which was my first book. And it's very different from our culture in that there's magic. It's also sort of Renaissance-esque, I want to say. People like to say medieval, but I take exception to that because no. Yeah, don't get me started there. But so there is magic. There's also, at least in Lady of Stone, there's a very strict class system. There are nobles, there are courtiers, and then there's everybody else. And usually they don't mingle at all. So I think that I'd really like crossing that class divide, especially where romance is concerned, and having people have to really deal with the repercussions of that. So think swords and sorcery, sort of adventure. Yeah.
Very
That's pretty much it.
No, I love it. I love the whole class system thing. Sounds awesome. Sheri, what about the culture of Avenging Avery?
So in Avenging Avery, I think the basis of the culture is that you have people who don't just believe that the preternatural creatures exist, they actually know that they exist, but that it's still not common knowledge, and that most of the population just goes about oblivious to this shadow world that exists. And so what has to happen, and this is a common theme you'll see in my books, is that you have those who want to resist believing it, that no matter what you do, I just know that's crazy, I don't want to believe that. But through the course of the story, they come to understand that it is more than folklore, that it is a part of the world that they exist in, and they no longer can ignore it.
Interesting. So it's almost as if the reader gets to watch that journey play out of those non-believers.
Right.
Yeah, I love that. Raand, same question to you in terms.
So of the 3 species that I've focused on so far are the shapeshifters, the wares, the vampires, and the fae. And they each have their own particular worlds and social structure. The shapeshifters, the wares in particular, there are wolf wares, there are cat wares who appear in the first few books. They're very pack oriented, so there's a lot of power dynamic built into the world and into the characters and into the relationships and into the sexual relationships in the book, in the books. And that's what I really wanted to explore a lot. And otherwise, the greater story arc is how a minority population survives when they can actually be physically assaulted with intent to obliterate. I mean, that's kind of the survival arc, is really the arc throughout the story, but it's really a romance series. It's not super heavy. There's a lot of action and a lot of romance.
Sounds like romance with some high stakes.
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah, for sure. Missouri, what about the culture in your release?
It's similar to what you might expect, I guess, where we are now if we were maybe, I don't know, 50 years in the future. So if you played out sort of what's happening now in the news and the sort of disparity in income got a little wider, if you throw in some climate sort of refugees from coastal regions that are sinking, and then I guess the stakes are getting higher because everything that everybody's warning us about now, it's sort of coming to pass in the time that my characters are. So it's playing off a lot of headlines, I guess, but just sort of, as I said earlier, asking the what if, like, what if we didn't change course? What if we were presented with a scenario and we made bad choices? That never happens, right?
Never.
So Anyway, so very similar to now. I mean, the military is one of the characters is a captain in the Air Force, but the military mostly. And this is something that they talk about in the news now, that our military is planning for basically being dealing with climate fallout instead of like aggressive, foreign powers. It's more like just going to the aid to people like in a hurricane or, flood zone or the fires in California or whatever it might be. That's sort of the future of the military. But they still have all the sort of hierarchy of the military and sort of the desire to serve and that sort of heroic nature. That's all still there. But, the mission has changed.
Right. The goals, but it sounds like there is a lot of reality undercurrent there to kind of anchor it as well. All right, I'd like to move on to a new question now, and this might be because I'm a novice when it comes to your genres, and I'm super curious about this. Is it possible to write a speculative fiction novel without plotting in advance? This particular pantser is asking. Can you make it up as you go and then go back over the draft and fix all of your inconsistencies, or is that just not possible? Rad, what do you think?
I don't plot.
Okay, great.
I really don't. I write the paranormals the same way I write my romances. I start with central characters. I start with some conflict and an attraction, and I go from there in terms of the story. I mean, obviously in a paranormal, like we're all doing, we have to fill it out with the rules of the world, and however that is different than the world we live in. But plot is plot. And I think for me, it's always character driven. Every scene follows the scene before it. So the motivation is always there if you follow the scene before it.
Oh, wow. I wasn't expecting that answer. I thought you guys were going to tell me it was impossible, because to me, it sounds so daunting to not have a plot in place and to not have the rules and the magic system and the culture. But so now there's hope. Missouri, what about you? I mean, do you plot it all out in advance because it is so complex?
No, I never know what's going to happen. I don't know what's really going to happen until about 30,000 words in. And at that point, I realize, oh shit, this can't happen at all. I have to go back and fix this bit of the sort of the world building or the framework or whatever. So usually I know what I want the point of the story to be. Like I know what I'm trying to say, but I don't know exactly how I'm going to get there until I actually start writing, because I don't know about you guys, but unless I'm really immersed in the world that I'm creating, I can't figure out all the details, right? And then once you're in it, once you're living it, then you can go back and sort of fix maybe a line that you dropped or the guy that you left in the coffee shop, perhaps. Or I left a thread like that one time. I left the character just dangling out there, and my editor Cindy said, "Well, that's a real Hallmark moment. You just kicked him to the curb." I had to go back and bring him back to the story.
He's out of there. We don't need that guy.
Yeah.
All right, coming to you next, Sheri. So we have 2 pantsers so far. What about you? Is it possible in this genre?
Okay, I'm making it a hat trick.
Okay.
Yeah. I am a total pantser. I'm like Missouri and Rad. I know the basic characters. I know kind of the core of it, but where it's going, I don't know till I get in it, because a lot of these characters hide things from you too until you get into that story. And I've had somebody that I thought was good who turned out to be very, very bad. And I didn't know that until I'm in about 30,000 words.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have to blow through that first draft and find out what everybody's doing and where they're going and who really is the bad person. And then I can go through and clean it all up later. But yeah, I have to do it by the seat of my pants.
Okay. 3 for 3. Barbara, what's it going to be?
I'm going to make it 4 of a kind. I make lots of notes before I start, but not about plot. I make who I want the characters to be, so that way while I'm writing, I can know what their responses are going to be very quickly. I don't like writing first drafts, so I try to get through it as quickly as possible. I only know a real basic plot, like these people, what do they want? What's in their way? kissing. You know, in between what's in their way and kissing is just a big blank. So I like to just think of stuff as I go and just have my handy notes right there.
I'm blown away. Those were not the answers that I was expecting, because it seems so lofty to me because of how complex your stories are. But so that's fantastic, and I applaud you for that. I'm gonna toss out the other side of it. That what about writing in your genre might differ from writing in another genre? Raand, I'll go to you first, because we first met you as a romance writer before you jumped into paranormal. What about writing paranormal is very different?
I think for me, there are more storylines going on simultaneously than there are in a romance. Most of my romances are very centrally focused on the central characters. I don't generally have large subplots in my romances, although I'll take it back in the sense of the romantic intrigues in the Honor series or the Justice series. Yeah, there's a lot going on. I think probably my paranormals are most similar to the Honor series and the Justice series, where there are multiple characters, things happen in different places, there are multiple storylines. So I think that having written those, that made writing the paranormals more easy for me. But character-driven romances are very different. I was once told that I was a very claustrophobic romance writer because I focus so much on the central characters. And it's true, I do. I almost have to remind myself that there need to be other people in this world, because for me, it's all about the core romance. So that's the big difference.
Yeah, that is quite a big difference. And Barbara, you've written lots of fantasy and sci-fi, but you also edit lots of other genres when you switch to your editor hat. What's different about writing fantasy sci-fi than those others?
I have to stop waiting for something weird to happen when I'm editing, say, contemporary romance. I would love for something weird to happen, but I can't put my expectations on the manuscript like that. Even though, as much as I'm like want to say, and then a giant spider comes in, I can't do that. I can't write any other way. I've tried writing just non-fantasy, non-spec fiction, and it always just ends up taking a left turn.
The spider shows up.
The spider shows up every damn time, follows me from attempt to attempt. But mainly, yeah, that's it, is making sure that the things that are the same, or making sure that everything's grounded in characters, that we're with the characters the whole time. All of that is fine. All of that is the same, but I can't be like, how about here, a mummy, perhaps. Can't do any of that kind of thing.
All right, well, that's at least amusing for us to imagine you being followed around by a spider. So we're going to take that answer and run. Sheri, what's different about your genre?
Yeah, it's hard for me to, because I'm like Barbara Ann. I can't get away from it no matter how hard I try. I can be trying to write something normal, if you will. And for me, it's the sneaky witch or werewolf or somebody shows up, and I despite all my best efforts, I can't do it.
They were just trying to have dinner, and there's a witch.
Exactly.
Right.
A giant spider just comes right into the thing.
That's a good title. The waitress was a witch.
Yeah. Exactly.
There you go.
Yeah, I'm not much help on this one, because I'm a failure when it comes to anything that doesn't have things that go bump in the night.
All right, we'll give you a pass on this one. But Missouri, I have a feeling you can answer this question, because you have written pure romance in addition to your sci-fi. So how do they differ?
Well, first I would say that contemporary romance for me personally is a lot harder to write, because you can't just throw in a giant spider or a spaceship or whatever else, some like earth disaster. So you really do have to focus on the characters and what drives them and what has meaning for them. And so that's all that messy emotional stuff that's a lot harder to write. I think, for example, like Love at Cooper's Creek was probably my first sort of big, like, I'm going to write a contemporary romance. And it ended up being very personal. Like I was drawing on a lot of family stories and like just culture of the Deep South and that kind of thing. So those books feel a lot more personal because you're drawing on your own emotional experiences and those of the people you know. And I think the reason I like writing sci-fi or spec fic is it takes you out of that, right? It's the writing itself is an adventure and takes you out of your sort of usual haunts, if you will, puts you in a different environment. But anyway, I like writing both. I just think for me, contemporary romance is a lot harder.
Oh, I don't know. I think what you guys do is so much harder. I look on it. I look onto your stories in awe. I'm not sure I could do it, but to each their own. And so we'll definitely accept that answer. I have a quick question from the chat bar. It's going out to Raand, but I'm going to send it to the panel. 2 quick questions here. How do you organize your notes? And how long does that first draft take? Let's say on this release, because I know all drafts are different depending on the book. So how long did the first draft of this book take? And how do you organize your notes? Sheri, start us off.
Gosh, I'm trying to think how long this took. It probably took me 6 months to get through the first draft. And I try to do my notes as I go along. And because I have an editor who, you know, it's part of my homework to do that. But yeah, I try to do the notes as I go along so that I can keep track of who's showing up where and make sure that the timeline is progressing. Like I don't jump, you know, from morning to night back to morning and that kind of thing. And so I do it all simultaneously. Okay. And then once I blow through that first draft or I get through that first draft, then it goes a lot quicker for me.
Right. Good answer. Missouri, what about you? Where are your notes and how long did the draft take?
You know, this story, for whatever reason, probably took me longer to write than any one that I've done. I think it took me almost 9 months or a year to get the first full draft done. And I think this was because I'm personally really interested in climate science. It was hard not to put too much in there, not to bog the story down. Which is probably, so I had tons of notes. I just had a notes file and I just kept like, oh, that's an interesting fact. Oh, that's an interesting fact. Oh, that's an, and I could put that, you know, and then I was figuring out where I could put those sort of plot points and elements in the story. But then I ended up having to dial a lot of that back because what it was really about was how the characters were going to solve these problems and not necessarily all the science behind it. But I sort of think it's part of the exercise. I had to map that out myself